Let's come to today, to our being here together, to Myth 11, and become aware that we're involved with a strategic process, and that process goes by the general name of myth. And that myth is a dynamic horizon. And it is this dynamic horizon which needs to be appreciated for one of its ancient qualities. 5,000 years ago, when civilization began in Egypt, the name in an epithet for the divine was Lord of the Horizon. And it is the image of looking out to the vast African horizon and seeing the sun rise that has that poignant anchor root in the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. That experience goes back tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. There is a concomitant to the sun rising above the horizon, and that is the moon, and when the moon rises. There's an optical illusion with the moon. When the full moon comes above that far distant horizon of the earth, just as it is about to clear the horizon, it jumps. It leaps a little bit, as if it skips, hops into the night sky. But when the sun rises, there is a little bit of a lingering where the last bit of the sun has a split glint on the horizon. It's a diffraction wave that is just subtle. And so Re, or Ra, in ancient Egyptian mythology, is ascribed to the sun, but the sun as a carrier of Ra, not as Ra himself. The sun is a carrier of Ra, and in the mythology, one can only name the god who is carried. His name is Ra. The god who is behind the sun, not limited by the vehicle that carries an image of him, has no name, is nameless, is not given a name. So that the ultimate reality in the Egyptian pantheon is that every nameable god has a counterpart, and so they come in pairs. And because there are 4 primordial pairs, they make an 8, they make an octode, but there is a 9th who is not nameable, who is in the pure pre-process to the process of the mythic horizon, and that pre-process is the process of nature. So that the unnameable divine is the dynamic of nature, of the mysteriousness of nature, that is paralleled by the nameable mythological divinity of experience. And so folded like a invisible thread of dynamic energy, the dynamis, within the flow of experience is the invisible Godhead. Not nameable and therefore not knowable in the way of names, but able to be discerned when the nameable comes to its limit. And that this limitation of what can be named and designated, what can be called, the liminal of that is the spherical quality of the mind. So that the integral mind is a form, rather large, capable of a lot of complexity, but nevertheless a form, and being a form is limited. And the liminality of the form of the mind has a great concomitant to it. It has a parallel in the limit of the body. So that the body and the mind are both forms and are parallel and have limited properties, the quality of being limited, whereas nature and the mythic horizon of experience are unlimited. So that forms are energy that has been cinched and brought together, whereas nature and the mythic horizon of language are unlimited, and from this one got an original characterization of two modes in the universe. In ancient Egypt, they were called the limited and the unlimited. And usually that pair of limited forms and unlimited processes were taught in the original university of ancient Egypt, which was the Heliopolis priests in Heliopolis, where the Heliopolis recension of what is called colloquially the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Actually, its name translates as coming forth by day. And of course, coming forth by day means the sun rising. So that when one looks at 5,000 years ago, one of the origins of world mythology being written down, one comes to understand that myth is not just the stories of the gods, but is the dynamic flow of how gods have process-paired formations that come to achieve form in the mind, and also have a cognate form in the body, so that the forms of the whole body and of the whole mind, if they are linked by a healthy mythic dynamic where the language is truthful, then the body and the mind in their parallel will cinch together as a set, and one will have body and mind, and the "and" in there is all-inclusive. That the body and the mind will make a set of wholeness together, and that set of wholeness together then will allow for those two forms to be in balance. And when they're in balance, they will have an equanimity. They will have a quiet balance, an equanimity. And part of the balance of the two forms together, body and mind, will be complemented by the balance of two processes, nature and mythic language, so that one's language will flow not in an equilibrium with nature, but what is called an equilibria. And that is to say that the process of nature and the process of mythic language will have an equilibria in that their flowing comes together, and though they flow together, they're still distinct. It's rather interesting that in South America there is a natural phenomenon that illustrates this in one of the most remarkable ways. When the Amazon River comes out of the Andes And because it's coming through a certain kind of jungle, fluvial plain, its waters have a particularly brownish quality and cast. Whereas another very large river that comes out of the Venezuelan highlands, the Rio Negro, its waters are black. And when they come together around Manaus in the Amazon area of Brazil, the Rio Negro and the Amazon flow together for hundreds of miles, and though they flow in the same channel, the Amazon River channel, they flow as two distinct colors of water for hundreds of miles. And it isn't that they don't mix, they eventually have miscibility, as it's called, and by the time it gets to the coast, by the time you would get to hear the music of Bahia and the dancing, it would be just one river, and the delta is just all of one color. Nature and mythic language, though they flow together for a long time, they're not miscible in the sense that they're distributed as a oneness, but that they constitute a one which is two ones together. And so the reality is that in the natural integral, one is really a ratioability of 1/1, and only becomes oneness pure when a third process is brought into play, and that's consciousness. When conscious vision comes into play, then nature and language become miscible. And they flow without any undistributed distinction still active in them. And because they flow in this way, the process of consciousness is able to do something that nature by itself couldn't do, and the mythic language by itself could not do. Now, a conscious, languaged nature can transform. Now, nature can create, and the mythic language process can integrate, but creation and integration are not the whole story in reality. There are two other processes that complement it. One of them is transformation, and transformation is not an integral process. It's not just a creation process. It is like a recreation in the sense that it creates anew all over again. And so one talks about there being a natural birth, but one talks about there being a conscious rebirth. The consciousness can rebirth you. You can come back. And so in the Egyptian mythology, the transform pair that are there, Isis and Osiris, they not only bring the quality of transform to the mind, but they bring the quality of transform of consciousness back into language, back into the mythic horizon. So that the gods are renewed. They need to be renewed. And so that nature also is renewed. So that there is a quality there where Isis and Osiris cinch and work together, not in an integral, but in a differential way. And so one says, colloquially, the religion of Isis and Osiris in Egyptian mythology is the religion of resurrection. And though it is Osiris who, as the new expression of the Lord of the horizon, Osiris is not so much just the sun rising above the horizon, but is the successful current of the Lord of the horizon being able to go through the netherworld and to come up and rise with the sun. So that the whole quality of there being a netherworld and an above world, and in between them, like an equal sign, in an equation like the line in a ratio 1/1, that line, that horizon, that equanimity, that equality has an above and a below. It has a netherworld and an upper world, and it is the circulation of being able to go a full sphere that is the deliverance of the real. And so mythology is extremely important, not because it tells the whole story, but because mythic story is a phase in the way in which integral nature occurs, so that rebirth, so that conscious transform comes in as a part of the extended cycle of the real. And so the expression of it was never just full circle, but was an infinity sign. And the infinity sign is the 8, the ogdode, the octave. It's the 8 mythic gods laid into a horizon so that what comes through them is infinite. It isn't just 8 anymore, it's infinite. Because there can be any number of calibrations of order of the 8. And so it is not just one 8 on its side as an infinity sign, but it is a whole harmonic array. And when one goes to the earliest grand mythic temples where the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom in Egypt are displayed in one of the most significant artworks of all time, one goes through the pyramid of Unas, one of the oldest of the great pyramids, that has the complete hieroglyphic. And when one comes into the beginning of the pyramid right away, at the threshold of entering into it, one finds the beginning of the mythology right there at the doorway. And as one goes down the initial corridor, one begins to get the mythic story unfolding, so that one is walking forward in the dynamic of the mythic horizon expressed in this corridor with these hieroglyphs on the walls. And as one comes towards the chamber where Unas is placed, where the sarcophagus is, the mythology comes more and more to its grand revelation. And there, in the back and on the ceiling of the main room, one finds royal cobras curled in figure 8s, intertwined, so that literally you have 8s, infinity signs, standing straight up in the form of royal cobras that are interlaced, so that they form almost like as if one took a musical instrument and opened them up. And here are all these royal cobra infinity signs. Everywhere that one would look all together. And centered in the space is the sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus, the word sarcophagus is not Egyptian. The Egyptians had a different word for it, but the word that we get, sarcophagus, is Greek. It means, sarcophagus means body eater, because the sarcophagus is made out of pure limestone, lime. And when you place a body in a sarcophagus, after a while the limestone will literally dissolve the body, will dissolve the flesh, will dissolve the bones, so that eventually the sarcophagus will be empty because it will have absorbed the body. Takes a while, takes a long while, but eventually that happens. This process of the sarcophagus absorbing the body is exactly the process in making gold called Kupelation. In Kupelation, one takes the gold ore and puts it into a cup which is heated, And this particular crucible, this cup, when it is heated, will absorb all of the dross, all of the ore, all of the minerals, everything else. The only thing that will not be absorbed in that crucible is the little button of liquid gold at the base of it. So that the kupelation is the alchemical term. Alchemy means of the black land. It's the Egyptian royal understanding of its mythic horizon raised to consciousness. So that just as the crucible will show what is not absorbed, what is the real gold, the sarcophagus, which is empty, is available to a shaft of sunlight, and it is the sunlight hitting the empty sarcophagus that is the proof that the transformation has happened. That one's physical body, one's mental form, whatever of it can be absorbed and returned back into the natural process has been done, and what is left is now free to be what it is. Free to be the eternal gold of invisibility, where one is a part of the unnameable divinity who rises and is behind the sun. One of the great prayers in ancient Egypt is an homage to that which is behind the face of the sun, who seeing me reveals my true face, not the face of any particular life or of any particular style, but one's spirit that does not need a particular style of face at all. So that what we're looking at here with myth is we're looking at the way in which a language dynamic parallels itself with nature, and in paralleling itself with nature allows for the two forms that come out of each of them to also go into a parallel. The body certainly comes out of nature, and in our learning we've seen that the best way to characterize the existential form that comes out of the natural process is to designate those forms as ritual forms, because they occur by limited sequences of action. What is done, the thing done, in its limited sequence will produce such and such an objectivity. And so rituals, as we saw, are creating objectivity by delimiting action so that it produces such and such a purpose, such and such an effect. And by putting together the things made by the doing of them, one has that objectivity of the body. And that the body literally is objective because each of the cells, each of the veins, each of the neurons, all of the ionic channels, the mitochondria, all of the objectivity of the body coordinates together, and all of its variety and variation integrals together so that one has not only the body becoming objective, but the objective body again yielding a furthering of the integration, furthering of the integral process, and what comes out of ritual is myth. So if there's a phase of nature, there's a phase of nature which is a process, which yields a phase of objectivity, ritual, which further cues in the dynamic phase of myth, which then integrates to a further phase of mind. And so body and mind being parallel, and nature and the mythic horizon of language being parallel, when they come together as a pair of pairs, you get a square, but it's not a square of form. It's a square where there are two sides that are formal and objective, and two sides that are dynamic and pure process. So that one has to learn to look with a particular kind of geometricity to see that this is how it is. And one of the most ancient ways in which it was taught in ancient Egypt, the limit and the limitless, as we were talking about, the limit of form. Forms are limited, processes unlimited. The classic way in which it was produced in the West that survived is not from the Heliopolis priesthood in the mythology of Egypt, but in the Mathematique of Pythagoras. And in Pythagorean mystical mathematics, there are whole lists of opposites, and the first one is limit and unlimited. The apeiron is unlimited. The apeiron is limited. And so limited and unlimited in Pythagoras, and also one finds at the same time in Pythagoras the Pythagorean triangle. But the Pythagorean triangle is not just one triangle where the two sides are equal to the hypotenuse. A side of 3, a side of 4 gives you the hypotenuse of 5. And squaring them so that you get areas, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, equal 5 squared, which is 25. But in the ancient Egyptian understanding, it isn't one triangle, but a pair of triangles. It isn't one right triangle, it is a pair of right triangles. And they are made because the hypotenuse is the diagonal of a square. And if you make a square and have a diagonal in it, you no longer have the 3, 4, 5 right angle, but you have 4 sides which are even outside of cardinal whole numbers, whatever they happen to be. And the diagonal of that will be the way in which those two triangles have equanimity. They will have that diagonal. And one of the architects who rediscovered that and used that in our time was Buckminster Fuller. That if one understands that the diagonal of a square carries the dynamic of the reality of that form, then if you use the diagonals of interlocking squares in a very special geometric way, one will come up with a structure that is universally strong, not because it's strong post and beam, but it's strong because all of its elements will relate dynamically with each other and distribute. He called the distribution of that equilibria tensegrity. That there are two kinds of elements in a tensegrity. There are elements that are there because of compression, and there are elements there because of tension. And the compressed elements are forms, objective forms, and the tension elements are the dynamic processes. And when you can bring form and process together in a fully distributed balance, you get, Fuller called it tensegrity, and he said, out of this you will get a sphericality, which is universally real and therefore as strong as it ever needs to be. And not only that, but its calibration in terms of size will hold that proportion throughout the universe. So he said, in one of his ways, that there is no inherent size limitation to what a conscious intelligence informed in doing with nature and experience flowing together. There's no limitation to the size of what one can work with, either very, very, very minutely or enormously large. And as you get both very, very, very small and very, very, very large, what happens in a tensegrity structure is something extremely strange. As the structure grows, both large, very large, or small, very small, it becomes lighter and enlarges like a balloon membrane. Hence, at very great dimensions, such structures would tend to 0 dimensions, to comparative invisibility. When one gets very, very large, it's invisible. And when one gets very, very small, it's invisible. Hidden in this is one of the conscious keys to Einstein's relativity. And one begins to see that understanding myth in the way that we're coming to it gives us the chance to develop a further integral of meaning in our minds, so that our symbols are going to become more powerful than they have ever been before, and also that entire ecology of integral, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, are going to be available to consciousness and conscious transform, so that they don't just transform once, which would be like a transformation of water to the wine, but that they're available for a second transform, and that's where the wine can be further transformed by distillation into a cognac. And if you can move to that third state of the transform, and using your imagination, you can imagine now wine is very, very fulfilling naturally in its mythic sustenance of experience. The imagery of wine, the feeling tone of wine. Whereas in nature it's water, and water is very nourishing in nature. But just as water is nourishing in nature and wine nourishes in experience, cognac, or like liqueurs, and they're called in alchemy liqueurs, they're also colloquially called spirits. The spirits are like a cognac. They nourish in a third order, a third process. But what we're finding in our education, what we're finding in our learning, is that there's a fourth phase, a fourth process, which is as powerful to consciousness as experience is to nature. Just like wine is a fermentation transform of water, and just as that relationship holds in the differential, there is a further transform of conscious process, a visionary process. And that fourth process has never been understood by man. Never. That fourth process is history. And history is not like, oh, well, your history, it's over. One sees all kinds of supposedly sophisticated New Age things where they say, well, the past should just be dead. The only thing dead about the dead past are people that don't understand history. Then you're really dead. Because history is a hyper-consciousness. It is a further distillation beyond the cognac. One gets then a kind of nourishment that is there. The high Dharma way of talking about it 1,500 years ago in the central part of the Gobi Desert was the perfume. One doesn't need to drink anything, water, wine, or cognac. It is the perfume of the spirit that then nourishes one. And this is one of the better ways to talk about it. This whole quality of there being challenges of several different levels, several different orders, is all mitigated when the mind doesn't understand that there are two completely different modes There's an integral mode and there's a differential mode. And if you try to cram it all together in an integral, it becomes devolutionary right at the point where the mind reaches its limitations, and its limitations are then given to it by cultural bias. And so one of our volumes that we're using, Mary Douglas's How Institutions Think, and she, being one of the world's great anthropologists, shows that institutions do not think. They have no purpose. They have no ability to be individual. And by entrusting our symbolic thought forms to institutions, we rob ourselves of real integrals. But worse than that, cultural bias. If you work from a cultural bias, no matter how sophisticated it seems, single cultures, single traditions always have a bias. And it turns out that single planets also have a bias. The further that one goes out, single star systems have a bias. If you grew up on a triple planet around a quadruple sun, you would have a completely different kind of anthropology. You would have a completely different way in which symbolic thought would have its integral. And when one looks even just a stone's throw from our sun, say 50 light years, there are about 500 star systems in just 50 light years. How many are there in 13.7 billion light years? More than the sands of the Ganges. And so part of the quality of our challenge in the beginning of the 21st century is to wake up from stupidity that parades itself as some new way that throws everything back to medieval times. And the trouble with medieval times, they're always medieval. If you go back in that way, it is always medieval. It's always a bad night in a tough year. Let's take a break. Let's come back and reposition ourselves. We're in a flow. And we're in a flow that is a phase, which is a dynamic. If one looks to see what form there is to a dynamic, you're going to misunderstand, basically. One doesn't look for that kind of a thing in myth or in nature. What is there instead of a structure is a tension. And so one looks to understand what is the tension that is here. Nature has a tension to it. Its tension in a continuousness has an occurrence of change. Whereas experience in its tension always has the development of imagery and of feeling and of language braided together in the tensile flow of its process. And because these three are braided together in this way in a tension process, out of their dynamic will occur a space, just like out of nature, as change occurs, one gets not the phenomenon of, but one gets the noumenon of time. And as time occurs in the change of nature, space blossoms out so that existentials have some place to be, so that space blossoms out of time. Not out of the temporal time, but in a way that existentials, when they occur, they have a spatiality, and in a parallel way, when the mythic process creates a space, that space becomes image, feeling, language, toned, so that one now has a space of meaning. And as that space of meaning, that is the interiority of the mind. If it doesn't occur, there isn't any mind. And to the extent that it occurs better and better, or more and more, or as the Mexican gardeners love to say, more better, as it becomes more better, you get to have more salsa with your tortillas. And the interiority space of the mind can be enormously, not just large, but one has to shift to a different kind of a word, an amphitheatrical amplitude. There are minds that are so great that one is staggered by the immensity. And it can happen very quickly. One of the great examples in the 1920s, there was an intellectual from India, Aurobindo Ghosh was his name, and the family was quite wealthy, and so they sent him to Cambridge University in England. And in the Cambridge of 1910, he was quite adequate. Bertrand Russell teaching there, Alfred North Whitehead, a number of people. And he became a political radical, and when he went back to India, because he dressed like a British gentleman and had a Cambridge University education, when the British authorities arrested him at a demonstration, they wanted to make an example of him. So they put him into a very small cell with nothing. The cell was 5 feet by 7 feet, and they left him in there for a year to teach him a lesson. Indian upstart. And the man who went in there, when he came out, his name changed, and he was Sri Aurobindo, one of the world's greatest yogis. And when he came out, he was no longer limited to political action. He wanted to transform all of humanity for a new future, completely, and devoted the rest of his life to doing exactly that. There are qualities of the mind, and in a couple of weeks we're going to get to symbols. And right away, when we get to symbols, instead of going into like philosophy of symbols or psychology of symbols, which would be an error on our part. The mind loves to talk about itself in its own terms, because then it's really comfortable. Well, I know what I'm doing because I know. Whereas the whole intelligence of the mind is to know that you don't know. Otherwise, you can't grow, you can't learn. If you're just confirming that these dots connect with these lines like people told you they would, and you say, that is paltry in face of the discovery that the gestalts are not limited to the dots at all, then one says, aha, I get it. That minds have an expandable meaning space, and that one doesn't have any limitation on how much meaning one can entertain symbolically. But there's a further aspect to that. That's only the first transformation. The second transformation is to realize that even though the mind can have an indefinitely open space, it has a further transform where it can be free, where it is not limited to time-space at all. 4 dimensions are not nearly enough. Conscious vision begins on 5 dimensions already. And just as a 2-dimensional being has a very difficult time lifting themselves off the plane to imagine a 3-dimensional space, a 4-dimensional, instruction-addicted human being who thinks they know it all because they've got all the earmarks of knowing doesn't realize that that's like a big, huge sign to somebody who is really awake that you're really naive. The ego is only important to itself. There's hardly an asteroid even in the star system that gives a good goddamn. Not to mention the Kuiper Belt objects. There is a whole different quality. It's like somebody who knows the 12 constellations, the zodiac, and says, oh, well, I know all about the stars. Well, if one took the whole sphere of the Earth, there are 88 constellations. How about that? And if you go just a little ways in this huge universe, all the stars shift and change. Most of the stars in Orion that are really big are only 900 light years away. If you went out 100 light years, all you would see is the 3 stars of the belt and Rigel and Betelgeuse. That's all that you would see. That's the only thing that would be there. And if you went 900 light years away, there wouldn't be any Orion at all. So being addicted to feeling important because you know an astrology based on 12 constellations that are just connecting dots together, and you have no idea at all about the angular momentum of invisible structures that have just vectors and they don't need forms at all. The whole invisible realm is completely beyond you. We live in the 21st century where it is no longer viable to be ignorant on that scale, on that level. And so this is an education, this is a learning that presents the classic way in which that appreciation of that integral of 4 dimensions that leads to the mind is only halfway there. That's all. And it isn't a question of then going further with the mind getting more inflated so that it's more important. Oh, well, it's a conscious mind. That misses the point. It misses it completely. What we're looking at is a way in which to configure for ourselves so that we have ordinals, if we wish to check on them, not so that we can navigate with our mind, but so that our learning has some way to begin to get a sense that the development here is not only integral but also differential. It's transformable several times over. And so it has a lot of appeal that makes people who want to know, who have a yearning to know, uncomfortable. And I can't tell you how many people over 40 years bounce in and out. Couldn't understand a thing he said. Whereas my response immediately would be, wonderful, you're on your way. Now you can begin to learn. Krishnamurti's little book, Freedom from the Known. The first sign that one is ready to learn is that you lose the taste for getting it now, for having something clear now. And as soon as that taste is gone, it's like losing the taste for sugar and gaining the taste for really fresh vegetables, raw vegetables. Oh, I can open up so that I'm not just larger, but I'm free. And it is the freedom of the universe that is important. It is the open mind that is important, not just the large mind. And so this kind of a learning, a presentation, counts on you losing the grasping sense that you need to be clear on what is going on. We need nice outlines and everything. We don't. What is presented, and there's plenty of outline if you wish, but it is all provisional in the sense that it's on a table, but we don't even have to use the table. I bring all of this material here. I hardly ever use any of it. I don't need this. But I use this because it's teaching in a way of guiding that if you use this and learn to use these, it is very quick because it only takes a couple of years before you can begin to read through books. Not into books, not at books, but through them. And in this sense, one literally learns to read not only between the lines, but through the lines. And so symbols, instead of being the bright, integral places, the very confident centers then of structures that become very powerful ideas, that generate doctrines and ideologies and beliefs and all of that, the symbols become transparent. They become transparent first so that one learns to look through them. And one thinks at first that they're windows. Then one learns, because of one's deepening appreciation, that there's no glass in those windows. Well, then they must be frames. And after a while, one sees that it is only a sense of carryover that there's any framing going on, that there's no glass and there's also no frame. So that what happens then is that it shifts from a mode where one is looking at a window to the fact that it is kaleidoscopic and the language that offers itself as a jewel, that it has the facets of a prismatic jewel rather than just an open window. So that the open mind becomes jewel-like. And its kaleidoscopic radiance generates a new form, and that form is the differential person, the spiritual person. And the spiritual person is not in an alignment with the body like the mind is, but runs with a different mode so that it introduces a transform to both body and mind. But spirit, body, and mind are not the whole thing. There's another form. There's a fourth form. And that fourth form is the living cosmos. Not a universe of phenomena, but a cosmos where noumena and phenomena play together creatively. And there is a quality in that which is here in the way in which we can both have our ordination by looking retrospectively back, and as we increase, we're able to look back like jewel cutters, making new facets so that the past becomes scintillating. It's always then a new past. It's not a dead past at all. And as that new past generates its scintillation, it has in the cosmos a wonderful dancing partner, and that is a future. But not just a future or the future, which is a projection of the mind and is very paltry, but an actual future which is plural. Towards the end of his life, William James, he knew he was dying, and he was very old, and he had been through all kinds of experiences in his life. He once almost died and went insane in South America. He was with the Louis Agassiz's expedition to the Amazon. And he had been raised on the Harvard campus. His father was one of the great intellectual geniuses of the Harvard of that era. He was born in 1838. And he and his brother and sister were force-fed by the genius father to become intellectual geniuses. He learned to read Greek by the time he was 4 years old. And his brother Henry James became a haunted great novelist who was always wondering. One of the great studies of Henry James is called The Ordeal of Consciousness. The sister, Alice James, unfortunately was institutionalized because she went further out than her brothers, and she couldn't cope with the world at all. And when William, as a young man, went to explore the Amazon with the Agassiz expedition, he panicked and he got physically ill, and then he almost went insane. He was in a hospital for about 6 months, and they were going to wait till he was better and then send him home, send him back to Harvard. And he said, no. He said, I'm ready to go out, but I'm not going with the expedition. I want to go by myself in a canoe with just a native guide. And so he went into the Amazon jungles by himself for many months with just a native guide. And when he came back, it was the beginning of the classic William James, who became one of the greatest men of all times. He is the first human being to write a textbook on psychology. It's still in print, 2 big volumes. But towards the end of his life, he delivered the last series of lectures at Stanford as a guest lecturer. And the title of those lectures is called A Pluralistic Universe. Because by that time he had been the president of the Psychic Research Society, centered in London, for many years, and he understood the invisible transforms of this world are trillions of times larger and more important than everything that we know. And we need freedom in order to explore that. And one of the freedoms is to have a kaleidoscopic consciousness that is at home in a pluralistic universe. It is at home because it lives there in every which way that it will, and loves people who have freedom and variety. And so it is getting freed not just from the shackles of some ideology, not just from the inculcated blinders of something that is now parading itself as new and really is just futile and feudal, medieval. But in order to do this, we need to shift ourselves from subjects that have instruction to learning in phases, because it is the phaseability of it that gives us a chance then to go through all of the transmutations that we would like to go through. And so I'm putting a phase approach learning out for the first time. The past wisdom teachings were interested only in carrying one to open the mind. The classic Buddha never went further than saying, there is an other shore, but never talked about it. Jesus always went so far and then said, all of you will do everything I do and even more, but there's an other coming, and that's the Holy Spirit. this is totally different, is not limited to the mind at all, is the unnamed. Remember, as we began today, it isn't the sun. The sun is only the dancing mask of the invisible spirit who rises with that sun, rises with that moon, rises with all the stars. And there are a lot of them, a lot of stars. We have the ability now by late 2004 to have computers that can do 25 trillion computations in a second. 25 terabytes, and it's only 4 years into the century. There is such a great capacity, but the capacity is limited because of instructionally addicted minds that ceaselessly are yearning to have confirmations of old patterns. None of those old patterns can deliver freedom in this larger differential mode. This is not only the other shore, it's through the looking glass. If one wants to give it a title, in Buddhism, the old discipline originally is called the Theravada, the way of the elders, the Theras. And that transformed into the Mahayana, the great vehicle. And that double transformed into the Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. This is a transform beyond the Vajrayana. The classic Buddha never talked about it, but called it the Parayana. It's the way beyond. It's going beyond. And later on in the Mahayana, in order to tease out some possibility, they said the Theravada, the old way, taught the Dharma, but this is based on something called the Abhidharma. Abhidharma in Pali, in the southern pronunciation of the Sanskrit, the Abhidharma. The way beyond Dharma. And so later on in the Mahayana, it was called the High Dharma. And in the Vajrayana, the High Dharma was always a suspended jewel-like appreciation. The founder of that entire regard, which is the way to talk about it, was a man named Shantideva. He lived about 1,200 years ago. His work was called the Bodhicaryavatara, the way of going that guards the path to enlightenment. Guarding it from whom? From Hume. Because every time you want to have it, you have lost it. Every time you have that taste, to have that possession, you let it go. And so the hands that would reach out to grasp turn into shrieks. Yeah. They're called the hungry ghosts. The Preta. We live in a time where the planet is haunted by supersonic Preta. They're everywhere. They have organizations everywhere. Their yearning knows no embarrassment whatsoever. Too bad for them. Somebody's here to pull the string and have it all unravel. Because all of that is dastardly in view of the fact that we are spiritually mature enough to be free. We're looking not only back, but also forward. And when we do, we take a look that every phase has 12 presentations in groups of 4, 3 groups of 4. And that this is an ancient geometry because those 4 together can be put into pairs of pairs squares. And yet there's a way to have those squares so that they have a diagonal that's available so that one then knows that if one moves to another square that in a sequence is adjacent to it, those diagonals can have a very interesting relationship. And if one later on learns that you don't need to have the frame, one is left with the diagonal dynamics, and they can function in a tensegrity and bring invisible compressibles into play. And one of the aspects of what we're doing today is we're looking at one of the great examples in classic world wisdom that we're pairing with. We always use a pair of books so as not to get into texts, and paired with Mary Douglas's How Institutions Think is a classic Chinese Ming novel called Journey to the West, Qi Yu Qi in Chinese. And the Journey to the West is one of the greatest of all of the Ming novels, the Ming Dynasty, written sometime in the late 1500s and by one of the world's greatest authors. The Ming novel is like Greek tragedy or Elizabethan drama. It's one of the great modes of human artistic spiritual expression on the planet. One doesn't have to be Chinese, just like one doesn't have to be Greek to appreciate Greek tragedy, or even European to appreciate Shakespeare. One of the greatest translators of Greek tragedy in our time was the great Nigerian author, Wile Soyinka. Translated Euripides, Bacchae, almost as poignantly as anybody has ever conceived of it, in Lagos, in Nigeria. There is a planetary quality now where the exchanging of different cultures, not only just to get away from the cultural bias, but to make an enriched way in which the space of meaning begins to interiorize, so that one not only has a larger space of the symbolic mind, so that thought really has amplitude, theatrical amplitude, but that it has a complex nutrient of images, feelings, and language that is thousands of times more rich and more enriching than anything that has been here before. If one wants to boldly go where no man has gone before, it's into the planetary culture of the 21st century. And yet the planetary culture is only the crucible out of which a whole different quality is going to come. And that different quality will be here in about 200 years. We'll be able to participate in our lifetime in the nascent beginnings, but about 2200 we'll have a star system civilization, a stellar civilization, where people, descendants of ours, will be at home in a 1 light year diameter star system, just as if you knew your way around the airports on the planet, they will know their way around the spaceports of the entire star system. They'll be at home in that scale. And when they look out, they will not look out to see aliens out there, but to see participants in a larger dance. And will be invited to dance on that basis. Right now, we're a little radioactive, a little dangerous to dance with. We want your secrets. We'll take you to our leader, and then we'll interrogate you. It's a whole different quality that's coming into play, and this is the way in which it comes into play. The mythology of Journey to the West, written in the 1580s, 1590s, is a quality where the complexity of Chinese civilization by that time in the Ming, late in the Ming, had already almost 5,000 years of civilized development behind it. So the Chinese in the Ming are about where the esoteric Egyptians would be at that time. And there were still esoteric Egyptians around. When we come to journey to the West, we have to do 180 degrees because to the Chinese, the paradise is in the West. In the West, we are convinced that the wisdom is in the East. But when you're in the East, the wisdom is in the West. But it's very similar because in Egypt, it is the Western desert that has the paradise. And for very, very good reason. The Sahara Desert was very civilized up until about 10,000 years ago. And then the climate changed. The grasslands dried up, and one had the Sahara Desert. But 12 or 15,000 years ago, it was very fertile. There were very high civilizations in the middle of the Sahara Desert. In the Ming novel, the Chinese mythology had become so complex because there were different layers and different dynasty styles by that time, and the Ming is already almost 10 large dynasties away from the origins of dynastic civilization in China, and before that it goes back thousands of years as well. One says, well, why is Beijing the capital of China? Well, it was made the capital of China, one says, by the Mongols, in the Yuan dynasty, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. But the fact is, species before Homo sapiens were living in the Beijing area 500,000 years ago. The first development of fire on the planet is a Chinese pre-Homo sapien called Peking man. Homo erectus, not even Homo sapiens, not even Homo Neanderthal, way before them. So that one begins to see that there is a deep root, a deep, deep root that still has its resonances, but the resonances are not just there in some cultural way, but they're there in the landforms. The landscape receives the impress, and it has an invisible quality to it. One feels that magic in the Middle East because it has been cultivated and civilized not just for 10,000 years. There were Homo Neanderthals in the Mount Carmel area of what is today Israel 200,000 years ago, who in their way were cultivated because the graves all have the fossilized skeletons surrounded by the fossilized seeds of flowers because the bodies had been outlined with flowers so that they would be transformed by this imagery into returning, but returning as blossoms again, 200,000 years ago. And the same in China. The landscapes in China have this indelible quality of ancientness. And that Beijing area has a very interesting interplay. And one of the other sites in China, the one featured in Journey to the West, is Chang'an. And Chang'an is where 3 different Chinese dynasties over several thousands of years had their center. The first center that was there is in the Zhou dynasty, the makers of the I Ching. And the second time, 1,000 years later, was the Han Chinese, the Chinese Romans. Both times, Chang'an was the capital, and the third time is the Tang. And the emperor who put it back there in Chang'an was Tang Taizong. He's known as the Son of Heaven. So biography of him by the great Australian sinologist C.P. Fitzgerald. In the Tang Dynasty, the whole celestial astronomical opening up was of such a colossal thing that somebody who did a book on it entitled it Pacing the Void, the Tang Approach to the Stars. Because at that time, that third Chang'an powered up dynastic vision was such that the entire mythological array had to be brought into play as a single fan held by a comprehensive hand. And that fan was the complete array of all Chinese mythologies from the beginning, all the way up until their own time. So that one now had not just a mythology, but had the entire rainbow of all possible Chinese mythologies, comprehensive, so that it could be held by a single hand. So that you had this array. One calls it in alchemy the peacock's tail. When the peacock's tail comes up, the Latin phrase for that alchemical phenomenon is called cauda pavonis. It means that because the tail of the peacock has all those eyes on the feathers, one has 1,000,000 eyes. But they are eyes of beauty. So that one doesn't see mechanically, one sees aesthetically. And when you do, you don't just see the forms that are there, but you appreciate the invisibility and the spaces that are not in any there, yet occur and are important because they add the ordinality of powers. And so one has now not just counting, but one has a mathematic. Next week we're going to come back and we're going to look at Mary Douglas in one of her most poignant books, Natural Symbols, which after about 30 years she did another edition adding more to it. Because there's something in when symbols are natural, they only become natural because our mythological space of the mind has been generated with such a sense that is free. What mitigates its freedom is not so much other people or even institutions, but ourself. We are our own worst filter. Illusion can be seen through, but delusion is believing in the illusion, and it cannot be seen through. It has to be let go of. More next week.